Africa.
Okay, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you to this edition of the Distinguished Personality Lecture Series of the West African Transitional Justice Center, which is based in Nigeria. The lecture series is designed to help enlighten our community on certain aspects of transitional justice by scholars and practitioners, on the African continent and beyond, in order to support the evidence-based work that we are trying to push for within the West African corridor, and of course, on the African continent in general. And today, we have no other person than a worthy advocate, the father of transitional justice. You will say that transitional justice runs in his vein, Professor Tim Murithi, who is from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa. We thank you, Prof, for joining us. And to help moderate the event is my colleague, Gia Mukherjee of Stanford University, who is going to be helping us to coordinate the lecture. Just to give a brief introduction to our center, the West African Transitional Justice Center is designed to bridge the gap between the research and practice of transitional justice along the West African corridor and the African continent in general. And so we try to provide technical support by bringing scholars and practitioners together to ensure effective implementation of transitional justice processes, which has become one of the focal points, for managing post-conflict context within the African continent, and of course, in other parts of the world. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the platform to the moderator of the event, Gia, to help introduce the distinguished guest lecturer, and also moderate the lecture. Thank you very much. And thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gia Mukherjee. I am a researcher at the center and also a student at Stanford University studying international human rights and international relations. Today, I'll be monitoring the lecture along with Dr. Philip. Today, our speaker is Dr. Tim Murithi. He is the head of the Peacebuilding Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, and extraordinary professor of African Studies at the Center for African and Gender Studies, University of Free State in South Africa. He is also an honorary research associate, Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy in Africa, University of Cape Town. He has about 3 decades of experience in the fields of peace, security, international justice, governance, and development. And he has authored and edited over 11 books and has written over 100 journal articles, book chapters, and policy papers. Today, he'll be discussing transitional justice and the transformation of the multilateral system confirmation. And we are so pleased to have him. Thank you, Dr. Tim.
Thank you, Gia, for that very kind introduction. And very happy to be here with the West African Center again for this conversation. I would just like to request if maybe I could be made a host so that I can share my screen on my side. I don't know who's got Philip. Maybe you have the control.
Yeah, I think. Okay, yeah. I added the other. I'm just trying to do that right away.
So, if I could also be made as a host.
Yeah, you can. You can. I did that. I don't know what happened. Make focus. All right. So yeah. Okay. I think it should be working now. Yeah. You are muted, Prof. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Oh, can you see the screen?
Yes, yes. It's yeah.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Also, Dr. Philip, for this kind invitation to speak and to share some thoughts with colleagues. And thank you, Gia, for moderating this session. I really appreciate being here and looking forward to the conversation. So as you heard, that the title I'm looking at is the transformation of the multilateral system through transitional justice. And this draws on obviously a broad range of fields: African studies, international relations, peace studies, but also transitional justice. And you'll see as my argument develops, the idea is to look at the global order as it is, the crisis of legitimacy that we now have, past efforts to reform the UN system, which is turned into a fallacy of reform, African initiatives that have tried to attempt to transform the UN Security Council, and now increasingly also the global financial architecture and other dimensions of the multilateral system. And this is based on the historical geopolitics of exclusion. Africa was excluded, during the formation of these structures. So there's a very strong case from a transitional justice perspective to remake the world order, and from an African perspective. And that means that we as Africans who have been fighting for freedom, solidarity, and justice, and promoting reconciliation, are at the forefront of also seeking to bring about the change of the international system. What we see also is that there are an array of institutions, International Court of Justice, which the recent South African application on the Israel-Gaza conflict, International Criminal Court, other organizations like the African Union, European Union are instruments of multilateralism. But I want to focus a lot on the UN Security Council, or specifically on the UN Security Council, and how the power politics is globally that we see manifesting is in fact creating a crisis of order in the international system. The U.S. actors have been played a very active role in bringing about change and trying to promote a world order that almost simply reproduces the old structures, the old power relations that have existed since at least the end of the Second World War. And I would say to a certain extent, the UN structure has been betrayed. And what we need to engage in are efforts to revive the United Nations system. This is not new. I think going as far back as 1992, Boutros Ghali, who you can see there, made an attempt to transform the global system and in terms of peace, maintenance of peace and security. And he put forth his agenda for peace in 1992. He was the Egyptian United Nations Secretary General. And he's the one, in fact, helped to initiate ideas of preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building that we now currently engage in. And within peace building, obviously the existence of transitional justice processes. And the reason we need to look at this issue now is that we're clearly in a situation of crisis. We've seen a return of ad hocery in international relations. We've seen a precipitous increase in wars of aggression. Israel assault on Gaza, which we're currently still dealing with, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Saudi Arabia's invasion of Yemen, recent US-UK attacks on the Houthis, the Sudanese civil war on our continent, violent extremism, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Ansar Dine, and Somalia, the Al-Shabaab, also now Mozambique. So we have seen wars that are seemingly endless, and this really speaks to the failure of the UN Security Council, and it requires us to engage in a retrospective to look at. In fact, this is not something that is new, but something that has been embedded in a system that is essentially collapsing for quite a while. Since 1994, we saw the genocide in Rwanda, 95, the Srebrenica genocide, and 2003, I would say you saw the beginnings of the break with the past, and US-led invasion of Iraq, in which you see major powers, the Washington-London oligarchy of power, essentially projecting and intervening in countries, attacking countries. So the 2011 Libyan invasion, which was a callous disregard of the United Nations system, which has in fact led to where we are today with the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's a direct link between 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq and the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. They're both similar in that sense. You have a major power, nuclear-wielding state that's attacking a country that does not have nuclear weapons. And this is and the challenge here is that both of these major powers are actually members of the UN Security Council. So we have a major design flaw where the UN Security Council, the P5 that are supposed to uphold peace and security, are in fact the ones that are perpetrating the most injustice and undermining international security. We can more aptly refer to them as the UN Insecurity Council. And we see within the P5 have a very entrenched privilege and a sense of that they can do what might makes right, and they can do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must, which is leading to the emergence of different polars of power, like the emergence of BRIC, Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, resurgence of institutions that are tended to rival the Bretton Woods institution, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And this is because the global disorder also within the economic sphere is persisting, and there's a need for us to unlearn this very self-defeating and self-destructive attitudes. And this is where transitional justice comes. And transitional justice is focused on or deals with redress for past exclusion based on the pursuit of justice, restitution, inclusion. And we see some of these elements outlined quite clearly in the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which I would encourage you to download for yourself and read through. And this is where we are today in terms of the United Nations, and its failure to address peace and security globally is very reminiscent of the twilight era of the demise of the League of Nations, which subsequently gave way to the establishment of the United Nations in June 1945 in San Francisco. So I'd very much say we're in a San Francisco moment as far as the transformation of the multilateral system, the transformation of the United Nations is concerned, because the world is descending into this extended abyss, and transitional justice is a mechanism that can be used to re-legitimize international authority, but only through the basis of wider citizen representation and participation. So we need to focus them on institutional transformation. African countries have tried in the past to reform the United Nations through the Ezulwini Consensus of 2005, which was about 19 years ago, which was subsequently rebuffed. The African countries through the African Union put forward proposals of how to transform the UN system and ensure that African countries achieve the veto. A continent of 1.4 billion is not represented in the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which still deals 60% of it focuses on African issues. Meanwhile, France and the United Kingdom, which only have 67 million people, both members of that P5 elite group, which shows you that the optics are wrong and the basic design structure is also off. So we need to focus more on the transformation of the multilateral system. Africans have to take a lead in advocating for a TJ approach in transforming the multilateral system. When Africa works together, it can be a very powerful force in the international relations, though we have a long way to go as a continent to deepen our unity and ensure we work as one and we establish common positions. But Africans, we do have a track record as freedom seekers, solidarity promoters, justice promoters, and also reconciliation drivers. So if we apply this to the global stage, we can push for the radical global transformation of world institutions by calling for renewal and an application of the principles of transitional justice. What this might look like in the future, if we're talking about the development of a new democratic architecture, maybe we could even envisage the development of a new treaty that potentially could take us in a direction of deepening international global democracy, creating a world parliament, which is not a new idea. The idea has been around for 70, 80 years. A Council of Supranations, the African Union, the European Union, an Assembly of Nation States, Committee of Subnational Groups, NGOs, social movements being brought into some of the discussion forums, and unions and transnational corporations also being brought in, given the role they play as global, essentially citizens in their own right. And this can be informed by the principles of transitional justice, principles of freedom, solidarity, justice, global reconciliation, as I mentioned before, based on Africa's experiences. And it provides us with practical steps of how to push for the transformation of the multilateral system. There's one article in the United Nations Charter, Article 109, which I would encourage you to do some research on. You can quickly do a search on the website and find out more about it. But this article was included in the original document of the UN, and it's still there. It speaks about the convening of a UN Charter Conference to review the United Nations Charter to make sure that it's still fit for purpose. And clearly, 79 years after the 1945 conference, this has not yet happened. So this is something we can push for, both as academics, those who work in a policy realm, and those who are activists, to actually call for Article 109 to be invoked, to actually look maybe even talk about the creation of a new global treaty that will help us build institutions that are worthy of the 21st century. This Article 109, as I mentioned, would convene a general conference to review the charter. It can be initiated by 20 or 30 countries that are working together to actually convene, a General Assembly, UN General Assembly resolution. We've seen the UN General Assembly becoming much more active in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It issued a resolution. In the Israel-Gaza conflict, it has issued a resolution as well. And the attempt here is to try to address the withering away of the relevance of the UN, which is the pathway that the League of Nations went. And so what we need is a progressive group of states to actually pick up the mantle and drive Article 109. So if any of you know government officials who are keen to drive this agenda, it would be important to reach out and engage with them. Obviously, the beneficiaries of the system, notably the P5, are not for change. So African countries have to find a way to lead the way in designing and creating a new global institution based on the principles of transitional justice, as we've mentioned. This is really part of the process of Africa, reclaiming its position as an equal member of humanity and advancing the notion of our common humanity. So even as we speak, there's the United Nations Summit of the Future, which is due to take place in September this year in New York at the General Assembly of the United Nations. And there's a number of meetings that have already taken place, convened by civil society actors, including a recent one in Abuja, Nigeria, where a coalition of civil society actors convened to try to craft an African common position on the transformation of the multilateral system. And I commend you to look into that report that emerged from that meeting. It was convened by the Savannah Center, based in Abuja, Nigeria, which was previously headed by Professor Ibrahim Gambari, former Foreign Minister of Nigeria. And then there's a series of meetings that are taking place between now and September that are focusing on fleshing out the so-called Declaration of the Future, which will be issued at the Summit of the Future. So this is a very important year to try to push for change, to advocate for change, to write about change. And I'll invite you, all of you who might be focusing on this topic, to also contribute in terms of research, writing short articles, on writing papers and chapters to raise awareness about the need for change and transformation. And this is all in the interest of advancing our common humanity. And it's clear that the principles of transitional justice can be quite instructive in this regard going forward. So transitional justice, in this sense, can contribute towards the transformation of the multilateral system, but citizen leadership becomes vital. The ordinary people are the ones to help to drive this agenda forward. Governments most tend to have their own vested interests, and if we really want to see change, we have to be the change that we want to see along the lines of Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, who was the first, was a leading freedom fighter in India during the British occupation of that country. And of course, our very own on the African continent, the late Nelson Mandela, who was the first president of South Africa, who pointed out that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And we as Africans need to triumph over the kind of any sense of fear about dealing with these issues and pushing forward the agenda in a very bold way to shape and mold the conversation, the discourse going forward in terms of the role that transitional justice can play in the transformation of the multilateral system. So I think that is really all that I would like to share. Obviously, look very forward to the conversation points, the issues that might come up in the Q&A, and we can have a conversation going forward. So, Gia, I'm going to hand the microphone back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tim, for your very insightful lecture. I would just like to summarize your talk a little bit for the members of the audience, just so we can get the conversation started. I found it so fascinating that the instruments of the global multilateral system, including the UN Security Council, have very much, yes, fallen into a time of crisis with an alarming rise of ad hocery, along with wars of oppression, along with growing instances of extremism and factionist action on the continent, embedded in a system of political collapse and the resurgence of various armed groups. I think the major powers who are supposed to bring further global peace and security and justice are those who are perpetuating the oppression themselves. And thank you for your wonderful argument that transitional justice is a basis by which to re-legitimize the international authority through citizen representation, participation, and Africa as a unified, coordinated force is perhaps that which may take the lead in advocating for this transitional justice approach to global multilateral relations beyond kind of sectarian interests. So I will open it up to questions now. And looking at the comments, please kindly signify your question by raising up your hand to speak or type your question in the chat. Thank you. So we'll wait a bit for people to formulate their questions.
Yeah, sorry if I may go first, if I'm permitted. I'd like just to chip in. Thank you, Prof, for your very wonderful lecture, which recentering Africa, within the emerging multilateral order of international relations. The recent elections in Senegal has attempts to give a bit of a breath of fresh air within the West African corridor and on the continent in general, just because of terms of the presidency. We're talking about a president that's about 44 years old, and I would think that there's a lot of expectation on his shoulder. So I'm trying to link this to the question of leadership when it comes to transitional. Age has anything to do with the reception or the success of certain interventions, or what are the indices that we need in terms of leadership to ensure that we create sustainable interventions in international justice on the continent? In other words, what's the place of leadership in recentering Africa within the creation of this multilateral order that you're advocating?
Yeah. Would you like me to respond to that, Gia?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Philip. Very good question. And also, like you, I celebrate the successful transition in Senegal, where the young president, as you mentioned, 44 years old, has been appointed. Very hopeful sign for the rest of the continent, and we hope that it will continue in that direction. Yes, it's also an indication that change is possible. I think your wider question is around the issue of leadership. And what is clear is that if we are going to achieve change, we need to be quite bold and also courageous. And we need to be creative also in leveraging the opportunities that exist to bring about transformation. So those are the elements I would say that are central to enabling, to empowering individuals to take on the leadership role. And for Africa, we need to, in fact, embody the spirit of change that has gripped Senegal, embrace it, and also utilize it and channel it to help to transform the multilateral system. I think that's crucial because change is not going to come by itself. We have to be the drivers sitting at the wheel trying to push these agendas forward. And I think that is one way to look at the issues that we're dealing with. So that would be my response on the leadership question. I think for me, as this group may be mostly made of academics and researchers, you can demonstrate leadership by writing and researching and also trying to influence the debates in the spaces that you're in. It don't have to be big spaces. They don't have to be many people. Just have to be basically, trying to make the case for how we can bring about change in the world, raising issues, challenging each other, learning from each other. So I think for me, once we have done this work, at least with amongst ourselves, we then have the task of bringing our leaders, our African leaders, on board. And one would hope that the president of Senegal, being young as he is more open, more accessible to the majority of people, and perhaps even could be an entry point to engage about how we can bring about transformation of the global system. So that is definitely something that is worth considering and something worth keeping a focus on as we talk about these issues of change in the global order. Thank you, Gia.
Thank you for that response. I also have a question. I was going to ask, I've done some research on how like transitional justice mechanisms such as truth commissions, publicly available trials, and the like may be often subverted by local actors to kind of service the state's like power protecting ambitions or populist ambitions, rather than, foster genuine healing or recovery from exclusion. So how do we kind of overcome those strategic interests and incentivize local actors to participate in this broader, unified African transformation of the multilateral system rather than the more immediate benefits that not doing so may reap? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very important question. It is absolutely correct that transitional justice can be subverted, corrupted, manipulated by actors to suit their own agenda. And it has happened, and it does happen in the local context, particularly by political leaders that are trying to avoid accountability and dealing with the past in terms of the atrocities that they may have committed, or refusing to include other key actors within a community. So that is something that we have to most definitely guard against and be aware of. And then strategies, how can we disrupt efforts to try to subvert the use of transitional justice? And in the global stage, because we're dealing with geopolitics, we're dealing with powerful actors who will seek to avoid dealing, or at least acknowledging their role in excluding key parts of the world like Africa, India, China, Brazil, which are still excluded and outside of the system, even though they're quite sizable populations. We have to therefore be aware that there might be attempts to subvert or manipulate or co-opt TJ processes in ways that will actually prevent the outcomes that we're trying to achieve from being fulfilled at a global stage. And the key strategies to address that include some solidarity building. We have to build the solidarity networks with like-minded coalition of the willing, coalition of the visionary, and ensure that we work as a unit. Within the United Nations system, if you look at the General Assembly, the African countries are quite a significant number, almost 54 countries. If you combine that with Southeast Asia, Latin America, you already have a sizable group of countries that can push for change. And what is required, according to Article 109 of the UN Charter, is a simple majority of about 96 countries really to bring about the invoking of this article. So this is something that we, as I said, need to guard against, but also then work in solidarity and stick to our guns, remain visionary, and address any attempts to disrupt, potential efforts to pursue change going forward. So that would be my approach, Gia. I don't know if that responds to your question.
Yes, thank you so much for providing those solutions. I see we have some questions in the chat now, so I'll just go down the list there and then we can go from there. So the first one is from Peniel Momo. Is this transformation one of virtue or one of reasoning or one of action? You are hopeful about this renaissance, but what do you think about the way literacy and ICT can change the African role in the transformation?
Yeah, so literacy and ICT is absolutely crucial. As you know, we're in a digital age. Also, with artificial intelligence coming online, I think that quite a few of you are using ChatGPT to help with your research. It's every one of us is finding ways to leverage some of this technology. But clearly, self-awareness and your own personal research and learning is absolutely crucial because of lack of a lot of misinformation that is out there and disinformation also. So the ability to be able to do your own research is crucial, and awareness is also vital. And only then can you more effectively leverage, ICT. So literacy is absolutely central and key. But it speaks to a broader issue of education, I believe, or not only, ourselves as almost in academic intellectual elites, but also the wider community. So we need to become public intellectuals in our spaces, also speaking to local people and engaging with them on these issues, which sometimes seem far removed. Like the transformation of the multilateral system is not a conversation you're going to find necessarily around a dinner table in a social setting. So it's something that, we can play the role in helping to make it more accessible, more understandable to a wider audience, and then also including this in our education systems from the primary school level, secondary, tertiary, all the way through, and also engaging policymakers. Sometimes we think policy leaders may know everything, but in fact, we find that there are gaps in their knowledge in which we can contribute to, and leveraging technology can also be a factor that can help us to move forward in that regard. Gia, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And then the next question is from Dr. John Mark. He asked, you rightly referred to the birth of the League of Nations and the UN as critical junctures in the development of the multilateral system, and TJ was crucial in developing these processes. But both organizations were also the outcomes of 2 world wars. Do you really think that we can bring about peaceful transformation in the multilateral system without a global conflagration such as a world war?
Yeah, look, I think so. All the elements there are there of this so-called global conflagration. I highlighted the precipitous increase in wars of aggression around the world. Not recently, but going even far back 20 years. I mentioned 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, U.S.-UK invasion of Iraq, which in fact set in motion forces, extremist forces that are still at play, both in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, North Africa, and Sahel region. Africa. And so we are in the midst of a kind of a global conflagration, but it is spread across the world. There's not one unified force that is fighting against another unified force, as we had in the previous world wars. We of course have Russia versus Ukraine, and with NATO playing a very important role in that regard. But I also mentioned the Israel-Gaza invasion. I mentioned the civil war in Sudan and the crisis in the Sahel with the violent extremists, Sahel, Mozambique, and Somalia from the African continent, that are showing that the world is in a very precarious stage. And if we look at it from that perspective, we are actually in a kind of a conflagration. It is just it is in different pockets around the world rather than, as I mentioned, a unified global conflict. So this should also give us incentive to actually focus on transforming the system that is clearly not working. It's broken. The collective security system has imploded. So the idea is not to throw the UN baby out with the bathwater, but to invoke this Article 109 and find pathways to bring about a transformative change of the system that can give hope to not only our generation, but to future generations of humans who will have to deal with the global challenges that are quite overwhelming in terms of peace and security issues, which we're focused on, but also climate change, the refugee crisis, food insecurity, global migratory flows. These are all global challenges that no longer can be addressed simply by nation states working in isolation, but they need a collective action of nation states and governments and societies to work together moving forward. And we need to start thinking of ourselves more as a part of a group of 80 billion humans all trying to push in the same direction rather than pulling in each other apart in different directions. And the 1.4 billion Africans have an important role to play in this regard in advancing this agenda going forward. Gia?
Thank you. And one more question from Dr. Philip. He says, what would you advocate as most important, creating another structure for the Committee of Nations in place of the UN, or revisiting the power structures within the same organization for improvement?
Yeah, I think we got to the stage where we need to start looking at creating new structures, because the old structures are clearly have failed. They were developed in 1945, so we're looking at a 79-year trajectory. And as I mentioned, 30 years ago, in 1992, Boutros Ghali did attempt to revitalize and redesign the United Nations system. But those efforts have subsequently not led us to achieve the outcomes that we would like to see in terms of the maintenance of international peace and security, which is really what the UN was initially established to achieve. And so I would say that we very much need to start a conversation about creating a new system, which means triggering Article 109 is necessary, even as we are attempting to reform the system. But as I mentioned, the system has refused to reform itself, or at least the powerful entrenched power interests have refused to cede ground, have refused to allow the transformation of the international system. So I think that is the way I would try to look at this issue going forward, and focus also on creating a track that will help us to have a conversation, much wider conversation than just simply the 193 countries, much wider conversation that can draw in the whole of humanity into a discussion about how can we change the system for the better to deal with the global challenges that I mentioned, that we raised earlier on in our conversations. Gia?
Thank you. And now shifting gears a little bit to the role of the AU in all of this, Dr. Bulalani says the AU has recently taken up a seat at the G20 table. Some see this as a great step forward for Africa, where it now has a voice for a unit on a global platform. However, we know that AU as a unit has failed on many occasions to deal with our very own African issues here at home? How do you see the AU working on this global platform? Will this perhaps spur Africa to think bigger of itself and its role, first and foremost here at home and then globally? And I had a similar question as well, building off of that. Do you believe the AU is prepared to undertake a global TJ process at this scale, given its current resource constraints and also historical strife with Western multilateral institutions? Thanks.
Yeah, so it's quite a big thing for the AU to join the G20. It's quite a significant group of largest economies of the world, maybe 75% of the global GDP, all continents now formally represented there by quite a key significant countries. And Africa as a region, as I mentioned, 1.4 billion. Obviously, our economy is not as big as other parts of the world, but I think without Africa in the equation, I think we are, first of all, selling ourselves short, but also the system then is reproducing those patterns of exclusion, which historically have bedeviled the African continent and kept Africa almost outside of the equation. But the AU definitely has some internal challenges. It is not functioning the way we would all like to see it function as an institution on the African continent. And that's why the key strategy going forward has to be for the AU to find ways to link up with the African people, I would say specifically African think tanks, African civil society actors, African academic institutions, to use that, to leverage those insights, that knowledge, to inform its political diplomatic activities, but also to provide it with raw evidence and research that it can utilize to inform some of its interventions and build coalitions, right? That it can help to engage at a global stage, say on a G20 platform. And that is also one of the strategies that the AU can utilize to address the multiple issues and challenges that exist on the African continent in terms of peace and security, slow economic growth, refugee crisis, food insecurity. And so, yes, while resource constraints are a challenge, if the AU does not link up to its wider, network of African actors, African thinkers, African institutions, also like the West African Center for Transitional Justice, then I think it'll struggle to address some of the challenges going forward. But the AU should very much be at the forefront of advocating for a global TJ process on a massive scale, because Africa was, in fact, historically one of the victims of the exploitation of her people, going back to slavery, to colonialism, to apartheid, to even today's very exclusionary and predatory systems of global extraction that have been exposed in numerous analyses. So Africa has a role to play in actually pushing for a global TJ process and for dealing with the historical strife with its Western, partners that needs to be addressed in some shape or form. Europe and Africa, ultimately have a history. We have a tortured history. We have the 1885 Berlin Conference, the colonization, massive extraction. Countries like Belgium, King's Leopold, or Belgium used the Congo as its own backyard. British colonialism extracted multiple resources. French colonialism still exists to a certain extent as Francophilic across the African continent. And you can see the pushback on that now in some of the Sahel countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, that are pushing back and pushing out the French forces from their countries and decoupling or delinking with French corporate interests that have been extracting resources from the country. For example, Niger's uranium, which has been extracted, at very favorable rates to France at the expense of the Nigerian people. So Africa has to lead this charge. It's one way to heal the past. It's not going to happen by itself. and we have to use the means that we have, such as the arguments around the need for transitional justice, redress, and global processes to redress and repair the injustice of the past, and have restitution for previous exclusion. That's a very strong argument, and you find that Europeans, North Americans, US, Europe struggle to come up with cogent arguments against it, and it's something that we should leverage much more as Africans going forward. Thanks, Gia.
Thank you for that. I especially resonated with your last point. Now we have a question from Dr. Uwe Lawani. He has raised his hand, so let me.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you very much. Yeah, and thank you very much, Professor, for the lecture, for the time, the effort, and for the insights so far. I am curious. I'd like to hear your opinion, or maybe your assessment on the aspect of the economic considerations and how they impact on balance of power across the continents, whether it's with the influence of the bigger countries in Africa and the AU, or with regard to the economic powers and their impact on the arrangements in the United Nations. But let me just throw a little historical aspect into it, and then see if my question even makes any sense. And so at the end of the Second World War, when these new multilateral arrangements being set up, the consideration was to find a way to push back against the kind of adventurism that the Axis powers, as they were called, embarked upon. So in this case, we're going to balance power against Germany, Japan, and to some extent Italy. And so the Security Council was set up to reflect that, but at the core of it was some kind of recognition of the economic superpower of these countries, or the potential to become economic superpowers. So the US is there, of course, and then we include Great Britain, the Soviet Union, because of their vastness and how far they were able to push against Nazi Germany from the east flank, and then China, because they represented somewhat of a balancing act in Asia. And so we have come far from that period to now, and my thinking is, without some kind of economic gravitas, you almost cannot have a voice. And I'm going back to a popular local maxim where I'm from, part of Nigeria where I'm from. We say, that someone who's wealthy does not stoop to beg for long. And so if you have some kind of economic gravitas, and I'm not saying about having resources to be extracted, I'm saying that you actually have some, you're able to create knowledge, you're able to improvise your own technology, you're able to add value from what you have. In other words, you are resourceful. Now then you can go and negotiate, or you have something to bargain with. And my fear is that when we have these conversations, we look only at the politics or the demography or maybe the geopolitical considerations, without emphasizing the need for some kind of economic conversation or impetus. So I don't know. I'm just afraid that outside of that, Africa, vast parts of Asia, to some extent, the mountainous parts of Latin America, we're just going to be out of the conversation. You can't, as we speak, there are talks about war crimes already with Israel, with Russia, and whether they would ever get, whether the cases filed against them at the International Criminal Court in The Hague will ever see the light of day, because they are backed by, powerful countries or powerful nations around the world. On the other hand, we've seen Charles Taylor tried. We've seen Uhuru Kenyatta drop his presidency for some hours and go to The Hague. But so there has to be some economic heft. You have to have a bargaining power. Also, so historically, again, just to make one quick tangential point, and I'll let you comment. Ethiopia was there at the League of Nations, but then, Second World War is over. United Nations comes, and there's no conversation about any African country or any African representation. So I keep pulling back the conversation to the economic aspect of it. And I've had these conversations with Philip in the past. So I'd like to hear your opinion, or if you have any kind of assessment on this issue or any other thing related to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important point that you make. I mean, it ultimately money does talk, and resources, financial resources. And then I think the logical point you were trying to make is Africa has not been able to flex its muscles economically, as other regions. If you even look at our share of global trade, it's the paltry sum. It's not substantial. But the question really is Africa poor or is it impoverished? And if we were united as a continent, which is a big if, it's not necessarily a hypothetical, because that is the trajectory that we're trying to go to in terms of the African Union. It's our pathway. If Africa has been impoverished, it's been impoverished by who? If Africa is not as wealthy as it should, it's been rendered poor by who's? Well, including our political elites. Let's definitely put that on the table. But also, don't forget the external extraction. Then the question is, what is really, in terms of the resources that we have on our continent, why is everybody coming to the African continent and trying to set up all manner of engagements? We have Africa, Turkey, Africa, Italy. Most recently, we definitely have historic Africa, Russia, US Africa, Europe, Africa. Everyone is coming to Africa to find their own little way of making themselves, much more economically, fluid. And that means that we ourselves are not organized sufficiently to be leveraging our economic wealth. We have the economic wealth. It just hasn't been utilized the way it should be. So I don't think we can be discounted or just simply on the basis that we don't have the economic heft, as you describe it, from conversations about global geopolitics and engagement in the multilateral system. And it's certainly not a reason to exclude us from geopolitical decision making. I think that would be a path that could lead to the creation of a global oligarchy of power, which we could argue we have, but with a multipolar shift that we're witnessing, the emergence of BRICS, China, Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa, giving opportunity to other countries to actually have a countervailing point of economic power, which is happening now. So I don't think it is necessarily the only basis upon which we use as a metric to decide whether countries or regions should play a role on global politics, on international relations, and the UN Security Council. I think maybe it has been much more a dominant idea in the past, but now we have to begin to shift that thinking and say that, in fact, firstly, Africa is not poor; it's been impoverished. Secondly, we need to, in fact, have that presence and play that role in a coordinated manner as an African continent, which is the work we need to do as Africans. We need to do as African thinkers, writers, people who engage with policymakers and decision makers, to unify us as a continent, so we can, in fact, have that gravitas to engage, not only economically, but I'd also say politically. And I think politically really is the prime. There's a primacy of politics. There's a primacy of geopolitics, and we have to be in that conversation. We've also been calling for the transformation of the global economic and financial architecture, which has in fact played a significant role in the impoverishment of the African continent. If you just analyze the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, and the role that they've played, right? And the reason we couldn't push back on them is we didn't have alternate sites to actually get the credit we needed to develop our societies. Now there's a new development bank that's creating opportunities. And you can feel there's a little bit of wind underneath the sails of African countries, that they feel that now they don't have to rely exclusively in the Western power structures, which in fact were establishing relationships of exploitation, asymmetric relationships of exploitation, which have to be called out. And the UN Security Council really at the apex of that. So that would be my approach to this issue. Yes, financial economic might is necessary. It is useful, but it cannot be the only identifier of why or how countries should engage at the global stage. And if it was that the only basis, Africa would remain a zone of extraction, not only in our lifetime, but also into the lifetime of our children going forward. So that's the way I would look at that issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Uy, and thank you, Tim. Now, moving on to Dr. Phillips' question. In terms of ICT, there appears to be an increase in the weaponization of cybercrime acts to silence dissent, even within democratic polities. And how can we adopt an approach that creates a balance of cyber protection and the general protection of everyday individual rights in today's rapidly digitizing age?
Yes, this is at the heart of the debate that we're having globally at the moment. The balance between issues of privacy, issues of access, the data mining that is taking place. In fact, the horse has already bolted. And as human beings, our data points are all out there, and we do it by engaging social media platforms, even platforms like this. But this is why I think the African continent is a little bit one step behind in terms of developing an African common position on digital governance, on AI governance. The good news is we do have processes that are unfolding in a number of African countries where, even to the point of legislation, there's some thinking going on, and a number of countries that have led the way. I'm thinking obviously Kenya with M-Pesa, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, which are on the forefront of some of the thinking around these issues. And I think there is a strong case for African countries to become much more coherent on this particular issue, which potentially could leave us again victims of digital colonization. Philip, there's another title for your next session, which I hope to listen in on. We have to guard against this. So it's an urgent issue. Academics, I think we have a role to, again, put this on the agenda and to push our policymakers to reflect on this. There's some initial conversation happening at the level of intergovernmental regional institutions on the African continent, but nowhere near where we should be. And it's the same with engaging the multilateral system. So that would be my approach to this. We need to be much further along the way. We're not there yet. And it leaves us vulnerable if we don't have coherence on this issue going forward. Thanks, Gia.
Great, thank you. And the next question will be from Dr. Maxwell, who has his hand up. So I will ask him to ask his question.
Thank
you.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much, Professor. I already posted one question in the chat, which I think will be asked later. But this question in particular relates to the previous question you answered on the UN and Africa, for instance. One of the things that I realized is most of the international covenants, international conventions that we follow these days were adopted even when most of these countries were still under colonization or had not achieved independence. I mean, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights around 1948, even Ghana, which achieved independence much earlier, was 1957. ICCPR was around 1966, and even the Geneva Conventions and all that. And these things actually apply to us. We ratify them, whether by coercion or by free will, and we are still using them. And looking at the other Bretton Woods institutions, as well as the UN Security Council and the things they do, all these things were established way before we even gained independence. And now they make decisions which are actually binding on us. You can talk about the Libya intervention, the intervention in Libya, which was by the UN Security Council resolution, because the General Assembly itself cannot make a binding decision. Decisions are made by the UNSC. Now, but it seems that something we are not involved is more like imposed on we Africans. So now the question is that even though there is the new development bank, even though we have China, Russia coming up, these BRICS institutions, how do we balance our stance such that we are not forced to actually abide by the rules of certain institutions? Because we've seen some countries being threatened to go the way they wanted to go. They've been threatened with sanctions, like my home country, Ghana. We faced a whole lot of threats. So where do we balance? Where do we leverage to actually ensure our development as African continent? Because until we do that, I think we are continuously going to experience this form of interventions, this conflict in the name of interventions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Maxwell. I think it's a very important point, and your analysis is spot on. And then you have to ask yourself why countries being threatened to go in one way or the other. So it's clear that there are geopolitical interests that are very keen to subdivide all of Africa's 55 countries, if we include the Sahrawi Western Sahara. Very keen to divide and rule, and actually have us pulling in all sorts of weird and wonderful different directions. And what they clearly do not want is for us to work as a unified force, as a unified entity. And that work is on our shoulders, Maxwell, you and I. It's no one else. I know your president has been quite, Nana Akufo-Addo has been very vocal on the need for, African unity and solidarity and all this stuff. And he's also leading on the colonial reparations movement, which one or two conferences have been convened in Ghana. But then we hear rumors of a contract that was signed with the Australians, I think. I don't know if that's accurate. You can help me correct that, where he's gone with an external, company on an issue which potentially could have found, corporations on the African continent, but could have done the same work. So there is a disjuncture between the rhetoric that we speak as Africans and the practice of what we do on the ground. But going forward, the only way we can protect ourselves from these extractive forces that have interest and threaten us, the only way we can achieve this balance is if we are unified as a continent. It's clear. ECOWAS has done a lot of work. You have an ECOWAS passport now. There's an East African Community passport in East Africa. Hopefully SADC will come online soon. ECAS and North Africa will follow suit. There's an African Union passport, which needs to be activated. For us to work as a people, we need to remove all of these vestiges of colonialism, which are still very much affecting us as a people, to work in solidarity. So that's the second element: Pan-African solidarity, Pan-African unity, Pan-African solidarity. And then a certain degree of coherence is required in ensuring that we are clear on where we stand and why we stand where we stand. We're not necessarily, Africa is not shifting to the east to side with China and Russia, nor is it moving away from the west, which is often a narrative that you hear peddled here and there. But in fact, we're standing in the middle, and the Indian foreign minister makes this point very clear. We're standing in the middle. We're working with all different partners, and there's nothing wrong with that. This should be applauded for being able to navigate these different forces rather than to pick and choose. So we need to be clear. There's a revival of this non-aligned movement. There's a recent meeting in Uganda, Kampala, about what are the key elements and drivers of non-alignment. And we need to be clear as Africa where we want to stand. We don't want to get drawn into any of these artificial global conflicts, which in fact are not serving us. Whereas we know everyone is here to extract what they can and leave us to our own fate. It's happening right now in Sudan. You can see the countries that are playing nefarious roles. In the background, they don't care about the Sudanese people. They're really there for their own interests. And once we've achieved that Pan-African, unity, solidarity, coherence, we need to be proactive and actually act before, not just recipient, complaining countries, but actually very proactive in determining what we would like to see, how we would like to see the world shift, and what is our role in it. And that means we need to get our institutions in order as well. ECOWAS is there. ECOWAS has recent, dalliance with Niger, Mali, and Burkina has exposed some fault lines that need to be addressed. But that is the only way that we will be able to maintain our stance and as a unified force. It might seem like a very distant task, but it's actually something we should be working on and should have been working on for quite a while and should continue working on. And you have a role as an academic analyst to actually make this case and analyze it and see where are the key areas we can leverage this more effectively going forward. That would be my approach, Maxwell. I don't know, Maxwell, if that's fine.
Yes, thank you very much.
Cool. And good to see you.
Great. And now I want to ask Maxwell's other question, which is how should Africa mitigate the issue of R2P, or responsibility to protect, and the concept of global war on terrorism? He says these are concepts that the US in particular is used in intervening in states where, in most cases, it didn't actually seem to end very well. In the case of Darfur, we saw that even though the AU idea of responsibility to protect failed, leading to escalation. And thus, given these failures, should we continue to embrace these ideas, and how should they be shaped going forward?
Yeah, that's spot on. There was lots of fanfare in 2005 when these ideas were introduced at the United Nations conference. There was a high-level panel convened by Kofi Annan of Ghana, late Kofi Annan, who was the former Secretary General of the UN. A high-level panel on looking at threats and challenges, security challenges around the world. Produced an outcome document in 2005 that laid the scene for the responsibility to protect and a number of other issues, establishment of the UN Peacebuilding Commission, so on and so forth. But almost in the intervening 19 years, some of the concepts became corrupted. And I would say George Bush's invasion of Iraq, under the guise of responsibility to protect doctrine, was a major corruption and distortion of the whole idea that had been neutered, by the United Nations in 2005. So that's where you began to get a lot of pushback from particularly countries in the global South, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, pushing and saying, no, we don't want this regime change approach to R2P. So it is a corruption of the idea rather than something that necessarily was inherently flawed. And so we do have a responsibility to protect civilians. It's happening now in many of our countries. We have crisis, I mentioned Sudan, Sahel, violent extremism affecting countries there. In Nigeria, we've seen Boko Haram, kidnapping, particularly girls and so on. So we do have a responsibility to protect, and it's in the African Union, within the AU Charter, it's spelled out quite clearly in Article 4H of the AU. It has AU as an institution has a role in intervening, particularly where major atrocities are happening and people are dying on an industrial scale. So this is something that for Africa we need to frame in a manner that is that helps us to pursue our policy goals and our objectives, and critique what has happened internationally. And clearly, as I mentioned, that the 2003 Iraq invasion actually set the scene for the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Whereas the global North, some of our friends in America and Europe will not see it in the same way. But I would say it is our role to say to them, The reason the system is collapsed is because you began to do things like this, and you actually undermined this entire notion of R2P, you undermined the notion of the UN Charter, and actually disrupted the Charter. And that is where we are today. But then again, that's a very strong case and a strong argument for transforming the multilateral system moving forward. Yeah, thanks, Gia.
Great, thank you. And then our next question is from Dr. Jade Bota. They're asking about the AU internal condition right now, saying even though the much discussed AU reform plans have not yet materialized as envisioned, and it's been widely argued that the organization is not functioning as well as we would wish, do you think there's sufficient strategic leadership within the AU itself, or do the challenges come not from the executive but from member states itself, given that one of the major challenges facing African multilateralism is the AU's struggle to manage
They remove this side now.
member states?
Why they remove like
As well, sorry, if anyone can mute themselves, thank you.
give me a
As well
power
as powers or lack thereof in the case of the Pan-African Parliament, conferred to the AU organs by its member states, and related to the role that AU should play in this process of global TJ, and what role do you see, if any, of the AU TJ policy playing in shaping this engagement as well? Thanks. Bit of a link.
Yes, no, it's spot on analysis. The reforms of the AU did not deliver what they had planned to deliver. And maybe it's because they were driven in a way that wasn't very consultative, it wasn't inclusive. It's very top down. The reform unit was conjuring up and making up new structures without really engaging with the people who were working within those structures. And subsequently, we have quite a few omissions. For example, the continental early warning system was dismembered and moved into different desks, which it shouldn't have. And now we have to rethink the whole process again. So we almost need reforms of the reforms. We need the reforms of the AU reforms, because they have created a situation where things are not ideal, the institution is not functioning, morale is low. And linked to that is issues such as a number of institutions across the AU have not been fully operationalized. Like the Pan-African Parliament still does not have legislative authority. It should have. It was part of the plan. And AU member states are still very much holding on to their so-called sovereignty, which is to some extent an illusion, given the degree of global penetration that's taking place around the world. And so it speaks to the deeper issue of the need to operationalize and implement some of the provisions that the AU has stated that it would and it should. And as African citizens, we have to play that role of monitoring and calling out the AU where it fails to do so. That is our role, and engaging with them where we can, right? But this is partly also the reason why, to a certain extent, the AU is faltering in achieving, the outcomes that it has listed for itself. We have listed for ourselves as African. But on issues where normative issues such as transitional justice, I think there's still a scope for us as African and the African Union as a continent to actually play a role in pushing for notions of global transitional justice. The African Union Transitional Justice Policy makes reference to the need to address historical colonial exploitation, extraction, apartheid, and so on and so forth. So we can play that role almost as a norm entrepreneurs, shaping ideas, influencing thoughts, and affecting policy discourses moving forward, which is really the way we begin to shift things. And we shouldn't be shy about that. I think we've done a lot of work to get to where we are. The AU-TJP policy took about 10 years to develop. Civil society think tanks were very much involved in the process. And now they're playing the role again in trying to push for the implementation of the AU-TJP. So there's we have a strong basis as an African continent to actually leverage these ideas at a global stage to push for global transformation. And I think that's what we should do. Gia, thanks.
Thank you. And our next question is pretty fitting, I think, given our discussion today. Do you think African leaders can ever put the people of Africa first? Even if they manage to do so, will the West ever stop interfering and allow Africa to breathe?
Yeah, very pointed, very clear. Look, ultimately they have to. But we as the people should not leave them to do all the governing. Governance is too important to be left to the African governors, so-called. Some of them beholden to forces either in the West or in the East. So as citizens, we have to play that role. In fact, a healthy democracy requires a very active citizenship. In the absence of that, we are allowing, almost tyrannical individuals who might have their own interests to actually drive our countries into the ground. This is why Philip mentioned the young Senegalese prime president who's taken over. And at 44 years of age, we hope, ideas he's going to put on the table are going to be forward-looking. We hope his engagement with white African civil society is also going to be, progressive and inclusive, and potentially could serve as a counterpoint to some of the, the geriatrics that are still holding on quite strongly to power and refusing to let go of our nation states, which is the reason why we are in the situation that we are. But yes, the factor of the Western and also Eastern now influence is very strong still. And again, ultimately, without strong leadership on the African continent and strong institutions, we won't be able to push back against, this external interference. So that's how these two issues are linked going forward. Gia?
Thank you. And I think that's the last of our questions in the chat. If anyone else would like to either raise their hands or type their question. But if not, I'll pass it on to Dr. Oh, sorry. Okay. And Maxwell, I think, has another one. Okay.
Yes. Professor, yeah, when I was in Moscow for some time in Russia, and I realized one thing that the Russians and the Chinese have been doing over the past years, and that is actually building their own kind of systems that will actually free them from the Western systems that we are actually used to. So when you're in Russia, for instance, they do not even use the Visa card. They have their own forms of card that they use. They have their own kind of financial systems that they use. In Africa, I've realized I've not come across any African country that is making efforts to, maybe there is, but I've not seen one that we are trying to make effort to build such kind of systems. So there is something I always say that in Ghana, my home country, when Google is shut down, almost everything digital is going to shut down because we are so used to Google that we think it is the only server in the world. But in other countries like China and Russia, they don't even use them. When you go to Russia, they use Yandex. They don't know what Google is. So how do we build such kind of systems? I believe that if we can build such kind of systems gradually, we'll be able to free ourselves from depending on other countries. And as a matter of fact, we are not going to be threatened with sanctions. But of course, once someone is feeding on you, they wouldn't want you to be free. So how do we build such kind of systems without, other people with their own interests?
Yep, I think we got the question. Maxwell seems to be a bit frozen right now. I think you got frozen, Maxwell. You need to maybe turn off the camera. You should be fine. But yes, I got the question. I think you're absolutely right. Alternate systems, different systems. There's a lot of conversation now around de-dollarization, so-called, which is mainly focusing on using our own currencies to trade with each other. This is definitely a pathway going forward. African Union, as I said, there were quite a number of issues that were put on the table 20 years ago when it was established. An African Monetary Union concept was already there. African Investment bank was already on the table, and we just haven't operationalized it. And that's also a good question. Why haven't we managed to push that agenda forward? There are examples of where African countries have innovated. I think I mentioned Kenya's M-Pesa, which is a mobile telephony system. But in fact, it's one of the largest digital banks on the continent. And people are using it to do their trade and get on with life. But clearly, so we need to engage this issue so that we can have digital independence and digital autonomy moving forward as an African continent. And as you say, Maxwell, we just need to start working on it. We need the thinkers to think about it. We need those with the technology know how to start implementing this on the ground so that we can actually achieve these goals that we're trying to achieve going forward. Thank you so much, Gia.
Thank you. And I think that's the last of our questions. So I'll pass it back to Dr. Philip.
Thank you very much, yeah. Thank you, Prof, for your wonderful lecture, which is quite very exciting. And I'm so happy that you're ending on this note, on a note where Africans need to start taking responsibility for their own future, you know, not necessarily taking cues from outside, but not necessarily following the models that we have from outside. And so that reminds me of the initiative of the African Free Trade Area, the AFCTA, you know. And one of the questions that we have is in terms of the gains of technology and industrialization, who actually are the investors that are going to benefit the most from here? Are we talking about Chinese companies that are operating in different African nations, or Africans themselves that own some of this industry? For instance, in Nigeria, there's a lot of debate around sorry, Max, are you done, or you want to contribute because we're wrapping up? But I think the Prof got your question.
Okay. Yeah, my connection was interrupted, so I don't know if everything was heard. If everything was heard, then I think that's it. Yeah, I think the only thing I wanted to add was the fact that these days, because of that systems created, instead of mostly the youth thinking about how to create new systems for the African people, we are rather thinking about how to get our things on that system. Okay, so for instance, you go to the movie industry, they are thinking about how to get their movies on Netflix. They're not thinking about creating their own form of Netflix. And this is one of the major problems that I think we have. So my question was, how do we free ourselves from that? How do we create our own systems? I've seen the Chinese doing it. I've seen the Russians doing it. Africa as a continent, how do we get our own without fear of being, interfered or sanctioned by some country somewhere because of their own interest?
Yeah, so I think that's also what we are discussing. Perhaps if Prof has one last word, would Adam have the floor? Because there's another comment on whether African nations and their leadership will be able to have credible leaders who will represent the interest of the masses independent of foreign nations, which I think is what you're saying. And that was also what I was trying to explain in terms of what the initiatives of development that we have from us as a people as well, like this free trade area, who are the major beneficiaries. And I wanted to end up with the Dangote refinery, for instance. So a lot of people will tell you that the refinery that is even named after Dangote, a majority of the shares are owned by outsiders. Nigeria is trying to build the economy from the depreciation of the Naira, and we had to sell treasury bills. And the accusation is also that those that purchased most of the bulk purchase of treasury bills was done from the outside. And so these are going to be people who are going to cash out from my economy, you know, in the future. Not to talk of the airlines that were operating in Nigeria, because there was no Nigerian airline that was going abroad, you know. There was about 300% increase in the fares. So you see airplanes coming on board and people are paying 1.2 million for a flight that initially went for 6 million, you know. So it's very ridiculous, the kind of expectation that we have. And except we as a people start to grow and develop ourselves and promote ourselves instead of you know, bringing ourselves down, then it becomes like a difficult thing to manage. So I don't want to know whether Prof has one last word for Max and
Yeah, no, I think you've covered the basis. I totally agree with Max on the need for entrepreneurship on the African continent. Yeah, and this is something that it's a fairly low-hanging fruit for African governments to actually create the enabling environment for our entrepreneurs to precisely create and invent new platforms where we can do our own trade, we can do our own showcasing, and so on and so forth. The insight and the technology actually is on the African continent. The challenge is to scale it up, economies of scale, to make sure we can operate at least at a continental level, and then begin to engage globally. But there are some challenges, as I mentioned, around the leadership of the continent, and we as African thinkers, writers, we have a role to push, to continue advocacy, pushing, and making sure that we can bring about change of mindset, particularly in the decision makers, to push this agenda forward. Sounds like Maxwell is a good piece. You should write for West Africa Center on strategies to leverage, continental know-how and put our people in a position to operate globally in much more independent, autonomous manner. So Maxwell, looking forward to reading that piece. Thank you, Dr. Philip.
All right, yeah. So I think it's about time. Thank you very much, Professor Tim, for your part of the center, always been so supportive. Thanks for the wonderful, insightful lecture, and for the expert answers to the questions. I mean, we've been getting feedback to say that Prof is indeed in control of it, not exaggerating. Who have the grasp of transitional justice on the African continent, without mentioning Professor Murithi, having been part of the process, from the start. So we're really privileged and happy to have you grace our platform, and we hope that you continue to stay with us and support our work. And thanks for all that you've been doing, in South Africa and for the continent in general. I have to thank my colleague as well, Gia, for the expert moderation. It's been a very seamless event, thanks to you, and we're really happy and proud that you keep doing what you're doing. Thanks for all you do for our center as well, and thanks for yourself. And of course, Max just joined us, so this is like a baton of fire for Max, who is also part of us. So he's already written 2 pieces. We are hoping to push them out, at some point. So there's a third one. Max, sorry, you're not going. It seems you're not going to rest while you're here with us. So Professor Uyi, Dr. Bota, and all those that joined us, we're very happy to have you around here. Members of our community for always being supportive. So thank you very much. We hope that we'll at some point to be able to create devoid of whatever impacts. I will thank everyone and wish you the very best, for the rest of your day, wherever you join us from, whether you're at the morning hour or the afternoon, or some that are also retiring. So thank you very much, and hope to see you very soon for our next program. So enjoy the rest of your day. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.